Rose. Join award-winning gardeners Chris Van Cleef and Teresa Byington as they chat with rose lovers and experts from around the globe. With each episode, you'll gain valuable knowledge and insights to achieve the rose garden you've always dreamed of. Listen now as we explore the world of roses.
Hello, friends. Today's show is such a special treat. Joining me are two of our favorite rosarians who just happen to be award-winning garden designers. Michael Marriott and Paul Zimmerman are here to share tips and tricks on garden design, a subject we get so many questions about. They're also going to be sharing about the garden tours they're leading this year. So this is going to be a fun chat. Let's get started. Hey guys, welcome back to Rose Chat.
Hello.
Nice to be back, Teresa. Michael, good to talk to you as always.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll be meeting up during the summer, won't we, Paul?
Yes, we will. Summer and then again fall. It's just we can't seem to shake each other, Michael.
And if so much magic happens, we don't want that to happen. No shaking, no shaking. Well, guys, it is so great to have you both and to hear from you on a subject that many of our garden friends want to know more about. And we've been dreaming of gardening all winter, and we're ready to hit the next stage. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you. Help us get this design process started. Whether it's a brand new garden, or maybe we're just doing a part of our garden or tweaking an established bed.
Yes, that planning part is so important. It's actually, people might think, well, it's a bit boring to have to plan it. But actually, it's very, very important if you want to get a good result. And I think it's rather fun, actually. Then you can spend hours looking through catalogs and books and websites and things like that and see what sort of roses you like the look of. And then you actually maybe get down to putting pencil to paper and drawing out the area where you want to put the rose garden. And then, just start drawing it out. And I think one of the most important things actually is when you're doing the research is to make a list of all the roses you think you might want to include in the garden and list them under their different colors. So you'd have a column for white, one for pink, one for yellow, one for apricot, one for red. And then you just have a brief description by each one, the height, whether it repeat flowers or not, sort of fragrance and things like that. And then maybe you can grade them according to which ones you really want to put into the garden and which ones you don't. But of course, the important thing is actually deciding whether there's a suitable space for your roses, for a rose garden or rose border in your garden, and whether it's a suitable position in terms of say shade. Is it going to get enough sun? Is there going to be too much competition at the roots? And just what sort of space you can allocate to it. And then the other thing, of course, is deciding what style of rose garden you want, whether it's a formal one or a very informal one or a very, very informal one. That's the great thing about roses, is that they're so incredibly versatile. You can fit them in just about every single style of garden, and also they're incredibly variable in size. So if you've only got a small space, then you can concentrate on small roses, and if you've got a big space, then you can start expanding it into having big shrubs, which are sort of 6 foot by 6 foot or something like that, and then incorporating climbers into the scheme. So that's just the wonderful thing about roses. Nothing can touch them, really. They're just so much the most garden worthy of all plants for so many reasons. There's no other plant that you can allocate a whole garden just to have to this one plant. So do some research, see what you can find, and work from there.
Well, I completely agree with Michael. The key word is planning. If you're doing a new garden from scratch, you only get one shot at it. And the more work you do ahead of time, and that includes things like soil preparation, which we've talked about in other shows, but the planting stage is so key. And if you take, you can do something as simple as graph paper, 1 square equals 1 foot, or however you wish to do it in metric. And then begin to draw the plants at the size that they're going to be. And that kind of gives you the idea of spacing as well. It's too tempting to cram a bunch of plants in. And play with it a little bit. And Michael talked about lists, and one of the things that I like doing, and I do this for clients as well, is I actually like using a spreadsheet. And I'll do the name of the plant in the left column, and the headings across the top will be the seasons, early spring, early summer, late summer, early fall, late fall. And then I will take photographs of the plants. With the roses, generally they're going to bloom all season, so you're okay there. But when you're layering in perennials, I like to take photos of the perennials and drag them into the cells under their respective blooming season. And if it spans several seasons, you drag several photographs. That gives you a visual guide to what the garden's going to look like in terms of color harmony. But it also then begins to give you an idea of, am I going to have color all season long? Because it's very tempting to do everything that's going to bloom in the spring, and then you have nothing in the summer. And for me, for example, roses shut down in the summer because of my heat. I don't have much roses in July because it's so hot. But that's when my agastache comes in. That's when my rudbeckia comes in. That's when my echinacea comes in. That's my color. And so by doing that planning ahead of time and understanding the blooming cycle of the plants and the color harmony of the plants, that extra work is going to pay off in droves later on. And basically save you from moving a lot of plants later on when you realize you've made a mistake. And by the way, you're going to make mistakes when you first start designing gardens. I look back at some of the designs I did in early days, and Michael, I'm sure you feel the same, and I go, what was I even remotely thinking on that one?
No, all of mine were perfect right from the start, Paul.
That's that British horticultural education, Michael.
Sorry? What did you say?
I said that was that British horticultural education you had.
Yes, you're bound to make mistakes. I quite agree. But the thing to remember that actually all plants, and including roses, are actually very easy to move. So if you do make a mistake, then they're actually very easy to move at the appropriate time. So for roses, that would be sort of in the winter sometime. And for perennials, they're very forgiving. They can be moved almost any time at all, really. But that's generally during the winter. And actually, that's a very important part, is to, when you've got it planted and it's all starting to look pretty full of flowers, is start looking at it critically. And, is that a good combination? Are the heights right? Is that planted too closely? And you make notes, and then during the winter or whenever the appropriate time, you can tweak it a bit. And that's what the top gardeners do. They'll assess their garden during during the flowering period, and see how it can be improved. And that's the fun part, actually. If you just plant it and then just maintain it, just weed it and deadhead it and whatever, then it's okay, but it's a bit boring. But the fun part is trying to make it really as beautiful as possible.
Yeah, it's that tweaking aspect that Michael's talking about. And another thing I always encourage people to do, and I do it when I design gardens, I leave empty spaces. And that's a neat place to seed maybe some annuals, or maybe you're going to raise some foxgloves from seed and in pots or in a cold frame and put them in there, or plants like that aren't necessarily going to come back and be perennials every single year. And that's a fun way to play with the garden and kind of change the effect and the look of it from season to season.
Absolutely. I think that's a brilliant idea, Paul. And I'm over here in the UK. I always encourage people to plant the annual called Phacelia tenacetifolia.
Beautiful.
Do you know it?
I do, actually. You showed it to me when I was there last time.
Oh yeah, and it's the easiest thing to grow. It's got beautiful blue flowers. It's incredibly attractive to bees and a whole lot of other insects. And actually, it's a native to North America. And it's used a lot for ground cover. But a few seeds of those sprinkled here, there, and everywhere are absolutely brilliant. And the great thing about annuals is that they don't have much of a invasive root system, as opposed to a lot of biennials and perennials especially. They can be very invasive, and they can start growing right round the base of the roses, which the roses really won't like at all. So I do encourage people to grow annuals, and the other ones, things like Nigella, Love in the Mist, and Cosmos is the other one, of course, which looks absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, Cosmos is beautiful. I've actually got a pack of Nigella seeds sitting on my desk that I'm going to be sowing in about a month. So,
of all the flowers I grow, Cosmos is the one that Mr. G says, "Are you going to plant Cosmos this year? That's my favorite." He's the tomato guy, and he likes the roses, of course, but I always get questioned to be sure, especially the white ones. He likes the white purity ones. So Cosmos is big around here.
I quite agree. The white ones are just so beautiful. I think all these hybridized fancy ones, they leave me cold, really. The pure white ones are absolutely fantastic. So beautiful and so delicate. And great cut flower, too.
Yes, they are. Well, guys, let's move in. You've touched on it a little bit, garden styles. Now, there's so many garden styles. But I would love for each of you to share one of your favorite garden styles. And Paul, I'm going to start with you. So what would be one of your favorite garden styles, and kind of help us achieve that?
Well, I like all styles of gardens. I think they're all beautiful. Obviously the English cottage garden style is stunning, but I'm going to let Michael talk about that. He is unbelievably talented at that. I'm not gonna preach cottage garden style to an Englishman. I'm not going down that road. But I also really like the formal style, which is more French, I think, in that style. And part of it is I've got kind of an engineering brain, so I like the symmetry of that kind of a style. Mm-hmm. And that style is more, there is a symmetrical aspect to it. The first thing I do when I design a garden like that is I look for what's my axis in the garden. Maybe it's a view from a kitchen window. Maybe it's a rear doorway. Maybe it's a porch where people want to sit. And what's my sight line? And then I try to imagine, the garden on one side and the garden on the other side of a formal style garden, generally with a center area. And that's how I begin to shape those beds. And then within the context of that, you can do what I call it controlled chaos is the word that I like to use. And there's a garden in England called Modestfont Abbey, which is kind of a good example of this. But you can take boxwood, or I'm designing a garden in Southern California where the borders of a formal rose garden are going to be lavender because it's a Mediterranean climate. I want a dry plant. And that formality and that structure of the boxwood, the lavender, whatever it is you choose to use is totally up to you. Within that, you can kind of get kind of a riot of color going on. Or you can just do a more formal type planting, which is just masses of the same plants. So it's the structure and the bones that you're looking for in that more formal style of garden. And the last thing I'm going to say is don't forget height. Always, always, always think, how can I take a garden vertical? That could be an upright yew. It could be tree roses. It could be a pillar, an obelisk. It could be an arbor that you walk underneath. But always think up and keep that structure in a garden. So that's that kind of formal style, which I really enjoy. I like designing those kind of gardens. It appeals to my engineering brain.
Well, they are really beautiful. When my daughter lived in England, of course, cottage gardens were everywhere. But one of her neighbors had a metal fence around their small front garden, and it was about a square, small, but it was the perfect knot garden. And it was tiny, but there was so much there to see, and all the different colors of green. They were so soothing and calming. Even though the lines were straighter, it was still very, very calming. And it was just such a pleasure to see it. I just loved it.
Yeah, it's a very structured kind of garden. You mentioned knot garden. For those of you who aren't familiar with a knot garden, that's where you would have your structural plant, be it whatever it may be, boxwood or whatever, and you would weave patterns within the context of the garden. It may be something as simple as X's that cross, but those create pockets that you can then plant within as well. So the structural plant that you're framing this whole thing becomes part of the integral part of the design.
Very beautiful. Okay, Michael, you're on. We want to go to the very heart of cottage gardening, so it's all about you.
I would I fully agree with what Paul is saying, and I think one of the just going to formal gardens, I think one of the important things to remember to sort of think about when you're designing it is what would it look like in winter? I mean, roses like a lot of other deciduous shrubs and perennials. They're not the most beautiful things in winter. I get rather cross with people saying they're upright sticks, bare sticks, because just about everything else in the garden doesn't look terribly exciting in the winter. So what I think is important to consider when you're designing the garden is what it will look like in winter, and that's where the boxwood hedging, or over here we use a lot of yew, Taxus baccata, and we can keep that whatever size we want to, and I guess that would be the same in North America as well. So yeah, think about what it would look like in winter with that hedging. And I always remember at David Austin's, if you look at some of the pictures of the formal garden at David Austin's, is this they've got the hedging either side of the canal, where the hedging goes in and out like a serpentine. And I remember they looking at it once during the middle of the winter when it was covered in snow, and this serpentine hedging was picked out, and it just looked so beautiful. So yeah, think about what it would look like in winter, not just a sort of nothing there at all. You want some sort of structure. But yeah, cottage garden style, I think it's very beautiful. You've got such a lot of choice, possible combinations of putting the plants together. And one of the great advantages of it is that it's a great way of helping your roses to stay healthy. The trouble with a formal, sort of pure rose garden is you've got a monoculture. And of course, any monocultures tend to encourage the spread of pests and diseases. Whereas if you mix up your roses with other plants, then hopefully the other plants will help to attract in beneficial insects, and they'll help to control any pests around. And also, because the roses aren't cheek by jowl, then the spores from the diseases won't be able to spread quite so easily from one plant to the next. And so it's from that point of view of helping everything to stay as healthy as possible, free from problems, is great. But that's when you start getting the wonderful combinations of plants. And so you can either sort of look at complementary colors. So, you might, if you've got a pink rose, you might want to put it with a deeper pink plant, a perennial of some sort, or you can go for a contrasting thing. So if you think about the color wheel, it's worth looking at the color wheel, where you've got the different colors all around, and those on opposite sides of the wheel will be contrasting colors, and they go very well together. But as opposed to ones which are sort of halfway round, as it were, or quarter of the way round, they really won't go so well together. But then ones either side of a certain color, like the pink, then they'll go well together. So it's worth just having a quick look at that color wheel. It sounds a bit complicated, but really it's very, very simple stuff, and it's a very good first step to achieving something very beautiful. The other trick that I use a lot is to actually pick a flower, if you can, whether it's a rose or a perennial, and then offer it round to other plants. And then when you put it next to one plant, it'll oh gosh, and that's horrible. It just doesn't go well together because the color's not right. And then some it'll look, well, that's okay, not too bad. But then some you'll put two flowers together from different plants, and they'll just absolutely, it just look so beautiful. So somehow they work together like magic. I suppose it's a bit like in cooking. You might put two ingredients together and you end up with something fairly inedible, but you put another two ingredients together and they really work together to create something even more beautiful than before. So yeah, I love the cottage style. The most important thing to remember is, as I mentioned, I think earlier on a bit, is not to choose plants that are too vigorous. Otherwise, they'll start growing. They'll start swamping the roses, and they'll stop water from going down to the roots, and they'll suck up the great proportion of the nutrients, and so the rose will suffer as a result. So plant anything you plant with roses, perennial, whatever, biennial, give them a good distance apart, not too far that they're sort of separate entities. You want them to cuddle up to each other on the outer extremities, but then not let the roots compete with those of the roses. And some plants, like Alchemilla mollis, lady's mantle, that's dreadful for seed, setting seed all over the place. So if they start doing that, then be a bit brutal and dig them up and plant them up somewhere else. And even things like foxgloves, they actually, if you dig up a foxglove during the summer, it has a huge, great big root system. And so again, foxgloves, they're great for self-sowing themselves around the place, and they come up in just the most wonderful places. But if they're right round the base of the rose, just move it away a bit so it doesn't compete with that of the rose.
Follow up Michael's point about the other plants being with beneficial insects. I can give you an example of that. You've both been to the Biltmore Rose Garden on the Biltmore estate in Asheville. And when I first started working with them about 12 years ago, that was just roses. There was nothing else in that garden other than some bulb fields and things like that. And they had horrible insect problems. And so we began to work on integrating other plant material to where now the outer borders of that garden are a mixed border of roses, yes, but a lot of perennials, and perennials researched to draw in and keep the beneficial insects in that area. And they've pretty much eliminated insecticides in that garden since they did that. So that's an example of what you can do to create that. And the only other thing I totally echo Michael on the color wheel, by the way. That is an invaluable tool, and take the time to learn it. Like you said, it's simple once you begin to understand it. The other thing with cottage gardening that and I'm speaking from experience when I first started playing in my own gardens many years ago, is it's very tempting to put one of this and one of that and pack a lot of plants in. And you end up with a very disharmonious look to it. And what I try to do when I design that style of garden, when I've got my graph paper or my landscape software, or whatever it is I'm using, I actually draw out shapes on before I fill in the plants. And I try to make sure that my shapes are reasonably similar in terms of size and square footage that they cover. So maybe it's 9 square feet or whatever the case may be. And in the case of roses, 9 square feet, maybe it's 3 roses. That's all it's going to be. But then if I'm going to fill that with coreopsis, maybe it's going to be a dozen coreopsis to create that and fill that shape. And the shapes can snake in and out of each other. They don't have to be like blocks or blobs. But that's a way to, when you're beginning to sort of not fall into that trap of one of this and one of that.
Yeah, absolutely right, Paul. And the other thing is, if you've got a good sized border, is to actually do some repetition of the perennials. So, things like, a salvia or a lamb's ear or something like that, you might want to repeat it along the front of the border to sort of help to join it together, as it were.
That's funny. Yeah, funny you mentioned lamb's ear. That's exactly what I used in my garden. I've got two gardens that are on opposite sides of each other, separated by a lawn between the house and the barn. And both of them have lamb's ears repeating themselves across the front of the border. And with lamb's ears, it's that silver, which is great. I love that color, but also the weight of the leaves and the foliage. But yeah, it threads everything together really nicely and draws the eye down the, whatever side you're sitting on, draws your eye down both borders. Yeah.
And the thing to remember about perennials, that they come in a huge variety of different shapes and sizes. So roses, to a certain extent, they conform more or less to one sort of shape. They're sort of shrubs. They're all shrub roses, whether it's a hybrid tea or an English rose or floribunda or whatever. And a lot of them have rather large flowers. So it's good to look at contrasting that with things like mullein or foxgloves or delphiniums, things like tall, spiky things, which will contrast greatly with the shape, the more informal shape of the roses. And also, because the roses tend to have rather larger flowers, then look at flowers, perennials with smaller flowers. So things like nepeta, and I know you call it nepeta.
I think it's nepeta, catmint.
Nepeta.
Catmint, yeah. So you've got the contrast there. You're playing not only with color, but also with shape of plant and size and shape of flower. So it adds, and it can all get a bit, you think, oh, it's just too much, but, just, as I say, play around with it and see what you can do, and then tweak it afterwards if you think you can improve it.
Yeah, and you can also, another contrast that I always try to focus on is foliage. Roses, Michael talked about roses having similar, flower shapes, and they tend to. The foliage on roses is very similar as well. I mean, there's subtle variations, but by and large, it's pretty consistent. So if you take something feathery like a bronze fennel, for example, or something along, or an artemisia or something along those lines, then you've got something that has really got some contrast to the foliage style as well, which makes for an interesting texture. And the repeat aspect too that I would highly recommend to people is, let's say you're using a blue salvia, for example. Well, don't feel that you have to repeat blue salvia. You could do a blue salvia, a white salvia, a pink salvia, but because the bloom shape and the growth habit and the size are fairly similar, you're going to get that repeat in a more subtle kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing that comes to mind is you want to achieve the most beautiful effect. You want the roses and the other plant, whatever it is, to flower at the same time. You want to try and have that sort of combination to sing together. And so when you're choosing your other plant, try and choose ones that will flower at the same time as the roses. And remember that, of course, roses are very rare, really, in the plant world, in that they have such a long flowering season. So depends where you are, they might start in sort of May, June, or July, or something like that, and they'll still be flowering way into the autumn. And so that gives 2 or 3, 4 bites of the cherry. So, you can start off with the early flowering perennials, and then end up with the things like the asters and things like that, angara, which flower much later in the year. And so you don't just have one hit at it. You can get 2 or 3 hits of trying to get those beautiful combinations.
You mentioned not planting certain plants too close to a rose. Could you expand on that a little bit, give us some tips on adding roses to whatever design we're doing, like things we shouldn't do, or maybe plants we shouldn't add, or things that we should? Give us just a little bit more on the adding roses.
One of the classics, I suppose, is the catmint called Six Hills Giant, which is a real thug, and a lot of perennials are fairly thuggish by nature. Really, they sort of. I jokingly say they're sort of. Their aim in life is to take over the world. They got a pretty flower, but they really aim to take over the world. And so they creep around all over the place with gay abandon. And so you've just got to be careful not to allow them to do that too much. And as I mentioned, Alchemilla mollis, lady's mantle, earlier on, quite a few perennials will self-seed themselves around the place. And that can be really nice, actually. I mean, that I always say in my own garden, the most beautiful parts, actually, the ones that have done it themselves. Nature has done it themselves. So in all respects, don't try and fight nature, whether it's trying to control pests or trying to control your garden too much. Allow those happy accidents to occur, and you'll be amazed how wonderful it can be. And if it doesn't work, then it's you can just dig it up and move it around or get rid of it or whatever. So I suppose when you're planting a perennial, say your rose grows sort of 4 foot across. So from the where the root is to the outside of the plant, it's going to be 2 foot, and then you're going to plant a perennial next to it, which say grows 2 foot across. So it's going to be 1 inch from the center to the outside. So I would plant those 3 foot apart. So the perennial foot of the perennial plus the 2 foot of the rose, that makes 3 feet. So I'd plant the perennial to be about 3 feet away. And in the first year, when the roses are still fairly young, then I would be sure not to allow things like six-hill giant and other rather floppy perennials to overwhelm the roses next to them. In latter years, it might be better, might be all right. It depends what sort of rose you got. But in the first year, you want to allow your rose to get away nice and strongly and not be overwhelmed by your thuggish neighbours.
Excellent. Paul, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I think that this kind of takes us back to the very beginning of the conversation where we talked about planning your garden on paper beforehand. If you if your rose is 3 feet across and you draw to scale a circle that's 3 feet, then you can draw your perennial at the same with a circle that's 2 feet across. And then as long as the edges maybe touch each other, but that's going to get your center 3 feet apart, as Michael was just explaining. And that's why that pre-planting stage becomes so important to, as Michael's saying, you have a baby rose, be it a container rose or a bare root rose, you think, well, I can plant something a foot away from that. Well, you have to think about how big it's going to be at some point in time. And I agree with the invasive. I've got an upright phlox. It grows about 5 feet, almost 2 meters. And it self-seeds like crazy. But I love it because it's kind of like a purple bluish color. And it looks great amongst the roses. But all I do is, as Michael was saying, when it gets too close to a rose, I just divide the clump, dig it up, and I move it, and then I have phlox in another part of the garden. So that's, you want to stay away from something that's invasive, obviously. But as Michael says, perennials, I've got Nepeta, my lamb's ears are need to be divided this year. That's what they're going to do. But you could either say, well, gosh, they're taking over the garden, or look, I have more free plants now.
Absolutely. One thing that...
Can I just pick up on one thing that Paul said? He mentioned paper earlier on. When I design gardens, that's the first thing I'm not a computer person at all, and how people design gardens on computer, I don't know at all. I've got a piece of graph paper, as Paul said, a pencil and a rubber, and that rubber gets used a lot. So you can make changes as you go along, and it's very satisfying. And you can gradually get there, and then you put it to one side, and you have a look at it again. And the absolutely crucial thing, which I think a lot of people don't take notice of, is the scale. So make sure that when you know where you want to plant, put a rose garden or rose border or whatever, make sure that you measure it out accurately, and then put it onto the paper, as Paul said, with 1 square is 1 foot or whatever, 1 square is 3 foot or whatever. Make sure that you draw it up accurately and you mark on the piece of paper what that scale is. I've heard this not infrequently of these are professionals doing this, of getting the scale wrong, and they end up by having the plant, all the roses 6 foot apart as opposed to 3 foot apart. So be wary. Or the other way around, you order twice as many plants as you need. So do take that very carefully.
Yeah, one square being 1 foot or 1 square being 1 yard can yield 2 very different results in the end. For sure, but yeah, you can. And you can also go to an office supply store. They make lots of little templates that are really convenient. If your scale is 1/4 inch equals 1 foot, which is pretty standard in America, then they'll have a circle that's 3 feet, a circle that's 2 feet, a circle that's 18 inches, and that's a real quick way. And it's $3 or $4 in an office supply store. There's some nice little tools you could use that way as well.
I have a book, it's a composition book, but it's all graph paper, and it's very dog-eared, and I just keep adding more designs as I change each year, which I do. One of the things that has been invaluable to me in the ongoing process of designing in my garden are pictures, and not just the glamour shots. Far, far away, take a picture of the garden as it looks frequently, so you recognize those thugs, or you recognize, okay, it's worth it, or this needs to be divided. So my memory, everything looks so beautiful in my memory, but maybe not so much on the picture. So photographs have been really important to me.
Photographs are incredibly helpful, and that goes back to what Michael was saying earlier. Make notes during the year of what perennials need to be divided, because come January, February, March, you won't remember because they may have gone to dormancy at that point in time. And I like to move perennials when they're just starting to emerge in the spring. I find for me, that's when they move well. And with photographs, another nice tip that someone told me years ago is to see if your garden is interesting in terms of the contrasts and the shapes and the things that we've been talking about. Take a photograph of your garden and then convert it to black and white. And if the black and white photograph is still interesting, then you're on to something, because now you've taken away all the color and all the glamour, and now you're just looking at shape and you're just looking at texture.
That's a good one. I've actually been taking all of these photographs and sending them to Walmart for very cheap photocopying, and you can actually do that in black and white. So for $3 or $4, I get a stack of pictures. I can see them. I'm putting them up on my board so I can look at them and study them, but you can also do that in black and white. So.
Just maybe a little inspiration for people. Both Paul and I have got books which we've written, which might be of help. So mine's called just called Roses. Is it called? Yeah, it's just called Roses. I had to remind myself. There's an American version. And Paul, what's your book called?
My book is called Everyday Roses.
Yeah, and I think both our books contain good inspiration for different sort of designs and ways of incorporating roses into the garden.
Oh, I have both the books. They're absolutely outstanding. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Michael. Now we're going to move into that area that's kind of hard. We're going to talk favorites. Favorites are always changing, just like our gardens are changing. But Michael, could you share a few of your favorite roses to include in a mixed garden?
The thing to go for, because roses are so variable, I always like to have a range of different shapes and sizes. So I love the wilder roses. The actual species roses that you might find growing in the wild, or ones that are sort of look similar. So some of the species do grow very big, but some of them are smaller, and they, although they only flower once, then they have the great advantage of hips in the autumn, and often lasting through the winter. So you've got things like Virginiana, which can grow quite big, but they don't need any looking after at all. So you just plant them and enjoy them really, and they're able to cope with very, very tough conditions. But if you wanted something that did repeat flower but looked similar, you could have something maybe like Kew Gardens, which has got white single flowers, and one of the great advantages of that is got absolutely no thorns at all. If you want something a bit more traditional, one of my favorites is one called Lady of Shalott, which has got gorgeous apricot-coloured flowers on it. Depending on where you are in North America, depending on what climate you are, it can either be grown actually as a climber or as a sort of fairly substantial shrub. But that starts flowering very early in the season. It just carries on until really the hard frosts stop it. And it's got a gorgeous fragrance as well. It's not the strongest fragrance, but it's the fragrance is just absolutely delicious. And then talking of fragrance, which I think is very important in a rose, is a smaller one called Desdemona, which has got creamy white flowers. It doesn't grow too tall, maybe about 3 foot, 4 foot, something like that, depending on how you prune it. And that has just the most gorgeous fragrance. And that also goes on flowering for a long time. But, we all have our different tastes. So, some people like the more traditional hybrid tea type shape. There's some like singles, semi-doubles, the fully doubles of the old roses. I mean, talking of old roses, I always encourage people to look at the once flowering old roses, because yes, they only flower once, but then they'll often be flowering for 5 or 6 weeks of the year, which is a lot longer than a lot of other things like peonies and irises do. And some of them are just so beautiful, such wonderful characters. It's well worth putting 1 or 2 of those in if you can. One of my favorites is one called Ispahan, which has got pure pink flowers, wonderful fragrance, tough as old boots. And you can either grow it as a fairly substantial shrub or a climber.
Oh, absolutely. I have that one. It is amazing. Paul, what are some of your favorites?
Yeah, I mean, well, Michael, I'll take Michael's list to start with.
I know.
Expand on that a bit. Absolutely. I'm going to give a shout out too for the single petaled roses, be they be species roses, be they, Tottering by Gently, which is a David Austin, golden wings, white wings, all those come into mind. Again, we talk about contrast in the garden. Well, there's a contrast in flower shape. And there's something beautiful about them.
Mm-hmm.
The single petaled roses. Plus, pollinators tend to like them because they can get into them. That's an advantage to that. The old garden roses, absolutely. They, as Michael said, they get the term once flowering, which sounds like they're like here and there and it's gone in a day, but they're 4 to 5 weeks. I'm going to give a shout out for the Gallicas. If you like purple roses, I've never seen a modern rose that comes close to like Cardinal de Richelieu or Charles de Mills. They just don't, and they have a charm all their own. And then climbers. Don't forget climbers in your garden. And I live in the Southeast. A great class of climbers for me are noisettes. I grow Rev d'Or. I've had it in my garden for 20 years. And what I like about these kind of climbers, and David Austin has a series of repeat kind of ramblers as well in there as well, is that the growth habit of the canes is not so stiff. A lot of modern climbers, while they're beautiful, the canes are very, very stiff and almost too rigid to work with. And I like the grace of a climber that just sort of drapes on a fence or drapes on an arbor, and the laterals just kind of cascade and shower off. So I would make a great shout out for those more relaxed kind of climbers, that I think they should be incorporated in any kind of garden. And then other plants, Darlow's enigmas in my garden. I've got just a mishmash of stuff in my garden that I love. One rose that I don't know if it's available in England, but it is now becoming available in America, is called Petit Prince, hybridized by Delbard in France. I've had a dozen of them in my garden for 20 years. I used to work with Delbard. It's mauve, like a sterling silver or a blue girl, intensely fragrant, and probably the most disease-resistant rose in my garden. It is an astonishing breakthrough in mauve roses. It's called Petit Prince, named after the book The Little Prince. And that's one of those roses that I think I'll always have in a garden no matter what.
I think the story goes, was it last year, Paul? I was at a big box store and I texted you and said, is this the one? And it was Petit Prince. And you said, yes, buy it. I bought 3. I did not regret it. They bloomed and bloomed and bloomed.
Yeah, it's an amazing rose. It's just incredible. And so, but it's one of the beauties. But like Michael said, mix and match. I mean, if you stop and think about it, you're a gardener and someone comes up to you and says, I got this group of plants. Let me tell you what they do. They come in every color of the rainbow but blue. They'll grow from 1 foot to 30 foot up a tree. And they basically, most of them will bloom all season or give you an incredible show in the spring for 5 weeks. I just described roses. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's why roses are the ultimate landscape plant. There's any need that you need for an ornamental plant in your garden, a rose will fill it.
Yeah, absolutely right, Paul. I mean, it's just easily the most garden worthy of all plants. There's nothing can even start to touch it, really. And why people don't plant more of them, I never understand. I mean, I think I know why. Is because it's people often associated with diseases. But actually, as you said with Petit Prince, there's a lot of varieties being bred and introduced recently, which are super, super healthy. And so one of the Austins is Olivia Rose Austin, which is fantastically healthy. So it is important when you're looking at to pick a rose for your garden, is to try and choose ones that are going to be healthy without having to spray them at all in your garden. And so that'll vary according to where you are, what climate you are. So you talked about the noisettes. You see the noisettes in this country are a bit hit and miss, really. So 1 and 2 of them are okay, but they really like hotter climates. Same as the tea roses, not the hybrid teas, the tea roses, they like a really hot climate. But they don't like it when it's cold at all. So yes, do try and choose varieties that are going to be tough and reliable and healthy in your climate.
No, that's very important in the United States because our climate is, as we all know, is so vast, and that's where regional information, local rose societies, local plant societies, local botanical gardens, if they have a no spray program, there's some regional trials going on, and so That's very, very important to research that. And I will echo the tea roses. I know Michael can't grow them, but in the southeast where I live, black spot country, they're the healthiest group of roses I could get. I have yet to find a modern rose that can rival a tea rose in my climate.
Such good ideas. In Zone 5B, we can't do the beautiful noisettes. I have enjoyed them so much at the Biltmore. I just kind of stand by the beds of noisettes. The fragrance, the charm, they're just nothing to beat it, but it just doesn't work here. But we do very well with roses from the Easy Elegance collection, and particularly Music Box. And one that is just outstanding is Tom Caruth's rose, Easy on the Eyes. It is a Helthemia, and it is so beautiful and fragrant. It's like the perfect rose. So I would certainly want our listeners to think about that one. And then there's the Petite Pink by David Slezak, the little sweetheart roses. It's a shrub that's just performs all summer long. So there, as the guy said, there's just so many to choose from, and they'll be your favorites if they're not now. Now, guys, before we start talking about these amazing tours, is there one final tip or word of encouragement that you would say to our backyard gardeners that are ready to start designing today? So, Paul, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I would say the tip that I would give is that this is a learning process as well as a whole lot of fun. Don't get, we talked about the drawings, we talked about the photographs. Do your research, don't do your legwork, but don't get bogged down in that. As Michael said, these are things that you could move around. You could go to a garden center, for example, when everything's in bloom, and they'll look at you like you're nuts. And I've done this before. And I'll just start grabbing plants and putting them next to each other in the pots to see what works. So the main thing I would suggest is don't be afraid of this process and have a lot of fun doing it. It's a wonderful, creative thing that I hope in my lifetime my garden is never finished, because that would be very disappointing.
Absolutely. Okay, Michael, words of wisdom.
Yeah, Paul is absolutely right. Just have a go. You'll learn a whole lot in the process. You'll have fun. Have plenty of paper, a good rubber, and a pencil, and just get on and do it. And then when you get to the exciting part of actually planting them, and you can stand back and see them all planted and then flowering, it'll be so satisfying to know that you've done it all yourself. So just have a go and see how you get on, and then be ready to tweak it and tweak it forever. Tweak it for the next 20 years until you're vaguely satisfied, and that's the fun part.
I've been tweaking this one.
And of course, just incorporate, and then seeing new plants. Oh yes, that's a wonderful plant. That one could go absolutely beautifully with that one. But the thing that I this is slightly off piece, but before you start incorporating plants, just make sure that they're I love plants that I know are good and not plants that are just introduced on the basis of novelty, and because novelty often doesn't mean beauty. So try and choose plants that are really beautiful plants.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories along those lines, the great garden designer of the last century, Vita Sackville West, who did Sissinghurst, and her husband. I had a book of hers that she had written, and she talks about, and this is like well into her career when she was world famous, and she talks about going to the garden center and buying a plant without any clue where she's going to put it, and then spends the next 3 days wandering all over Sissinghurst with the thing in a pot, figuring out where it was going to go. And that, to me, when I read that very early in my career, I thought, well, that's very liberating, because if she couldn't know right off the bat, there's no pressure on me now.
Absolutely, especially when I've been tweaking this garden for almost 33 years. So a lot of plants have come and gone. I miss some of them, some I'm glad they're gone, but I always have to make room for the new ones, because I'm just as excited about spring now as I was the first year. So it's just one of those things that just grows with you. It just never diminishes. Now, guys, we want to talk about tours. Now, you've both done several tours, but what I've noticed about your tours is they're a little bit different. They include beautiful gardens, but you also weave in education and extra time just to savor the surroundings. So could you tell our listeners some stories from previous tips so they can kind of get a feel for what your trips are like? And Paul, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the you talk about education. I mean, that's always sort of been my bailiwick or actually I call it de-education, trying to demystify all the myths that are out there about roses. And but yeah, I one of my favorite things is we were wandering through Montesfont with the group, and the head gardener couldn't meet us, and I'm saying that's fine. I know this garden well enough, and we came across a rose. I think it was Louise Odier, the great old bourbon that had been pegged, and was wonderful because we were able to do a completely spontaneous lesson on how to peg roses, why you peg roses, what happens when you peg a rose, and how to treat them, and those are the things that I absolutely loved about it as well. Just those spontaneous moments of wandering through the garden. And one of the things I try to do on my tours is I always tell people at the very beginning, if I can give you 3 or 4 things that you can take home and replicate in your own garden on the scale that you garden in, we've had a very successful tour.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. Okay, Michael, what stories come to your mind?
Just the enthusiasm and camaraderie that happens when people get together with a common interest, common love. My partner and I, Rosie, we run Todd tours ourselves in the UK. That's what we find is that people just have a wonderful time getting together, and they obviously they listen to us and look around the garden, but then when we stop for tea or cakes or lunch or something like that, everybody starts chatting away, and they're absolutely having a lovely time. So that's one of the main things about it, is just getting together, and especially after the last 3 or 4 years when we've been a bit isolated, then getting the chance to get together and talk with like-minded people who share maybe the same ideas or got different ideas about how to do the garden. It's so wonderful, so exciting, brilliant.
I echo Michael on the camaraderie as well. I mean, because Michael's tours and my tours are run very similarly in the sense that we eat meals together. And I think as much exchange happens over a lunch or dinner or over breakfast or even riding on the bus. The last tour I did in England last year, we did a WhatsApp chat room for everybody to be able to communicate during the tour. It's still active, and they're still all talking to each other a year later.
Oh, gosh. That's so cool. Now, Paul, you're heading back to England this year and to France. So tell us about those. Tempt us.
Yeah, we're doing England again this year. That is in the second week of June, I believe, and mixing it up a little this year. I've done the last 2 were Sissinghurst, Montesfont, in that area, then we headed up towards where Michael is. We're actually going to start in based around Cambridge. We're going to spend a day at Peter Beale's Roses. Peter was a mentor of mine, and sadly he's no longer with us, but his nursery is still stunning. And we're going to have workshops and all kinds of fun stuff there. And then we're going to make our way over to the Cotswolds and visit some gardens there, quite a few which are new to us. We're going to come to Michael's garden as well. Oh, wow. And we're even throwing in an optional evening to go see a Shakespeare play at Stratford-on-Avon.
You are tempting us.
Well, for me personally, since I'm bringing Americans abroad, I try to make sure that the tours, whether it's France and France starts in Paris, obviously Bagatelle, La Haye, and then we head down to the Loire Valley. Michael, this is, I think, an echo of a tour that you did last year, if my memory serves. Because Michael and I booked through the same. Yeah, Michael and I booked through the same tour company. And I try to make sure that we build in cultural aspects because, we have pub lunches. To make sure that those are built in and those cultural things as well. Yeah, because that's a big part of when you're coming from America, part of the traveling. And that's the reason why I don't do any more than 2 gardens a day. I will not do more than 2 a day because I want people to have time to have it maybe a free afternoon, which we did last year in Ludlow, and people were able to wander and experience the cultural aspect of being abroad as well. And no chrome and glass hotels. I detest those.
Oh. Listen at you. Oh, this is just the best. Just the best. Now, you both are heading to Australia and New Zealand. So, Michael, tell us about that big trip.
Yeah, that should be really good. It's you can either do Australia or New Zealand, or you can do both one after the other. So we start off in Adelaide, which is arguably one of the best rose growing areas in the world. Actually, they grow some beautiful roses there. So there's 2-3 gardens around there, and then we follow the south coast along, beautiful coastline, drop off at 1-2 growers along the way down, and then end up in Melbourne, and then visiting various gardens around Melbourne, really, really good ones around there, and to go to Werribee and various other ones. And then if you book on both Australia and New Zealand, then there's a couple of days gap, and then we go on to New Zealand. We're exploring gardens in the North Island of New Zealand. And so start off in Auckland, the botanical gardens there, and then there's lots of amazing rose gardens. New Zealand generally is a very, very good area for growing roses. And there'll be some very, very beautiful ones there. One of the roses that, one of the groups of roses that we very, very rarely see over here in this country is the Alistair Clark ones that are based on Rosa gigantea, which are not very hardy. And so we'll be going to a garden that has a very, very good collection of Alistair Clark varieties, which are very distinctive. So that'll be really exciting. I'm really looking forward to that. And in New Zealand, we'll be taking in the rosarians, which is where all the thermal activity is, all the boiling mud and bursting geysers and things like that. So it's going to be an amazing trip.
Anything you want to add, Paul, to that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is, Michael and I started talking this, 2 years ago, Michael, I think maybe at least something like that. And, Michael has traveled there before. Michael's obviously has a long, illustrious career with David Austin. And when he retired, that sort of opened up opportunity to do something like this together. And, we thought doing it together, first, it's just going to be a lot of fun. And we thought just a nice opportunity. And I have found from America, at least, a lot of people have wanted to go to Australia and New Zealand, but were reluctant to try to organize something from this far away.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what this helped, because this is all your hotel, all your transportation, coach, flight, even the flight from Australia to New Zealand. Basically you land in Adelaide and you don't have to think until you finish in Auckland. But we are doing some cultural things. We're doing, as I'm a train buff, and I found the Great Northern Explorer train, which will be taking from Rotorua up to Palmerston area, which is a sightseeing train that runs through Australia. So we're doing some stops along the Great Ocean Road. So again, we're trying to throw in some of those cultural aspects as well. And then also in New Zealand, Michael and I have the opportunity. We're planning on doing about a 2 to 3 hour masterclass on rose garden design, care, and all things like that. So it's a lot of, we're hoping what people are going to have is a lot of one-on-one time with Michael and or myself, and Michael's partner Rosie's coming as well, who is a renowned horticulturalist in her own right. So there's going to be, and as Michael said, a lot of camaraderie, a lot of meals shared together, and just a lot of fun.
Now, excuse me, tell our people where to go for more information.
For the Australia-New Zealand one, you need to look at Botanica Tours. I think it's Botanica Tours.
Just botanicatours.com.
Yeah, and there'll be the Australian-New Zealand one in there.
Yeah, and you can search that by... you can, when you go to Botanica Tours, if you put in the search engine, you either put my last name, Zimmerman, or Michael's last name, Marriott, the tours will automatically filter up. So you don't have to hunt for them. That's a real easy way. What I've done with mine is on my website, which is just paulzimmermanroses.com. From the home page, there's a link to a page that has information and links to all the tours, including the one that Michael and I are doing. That's another easy way to get in there as well. And Michael and I are all over the internet. If nothing else, just find one of us and ask us about it, and we'll point you in the right direction. Yeah,
and I've got my own website as well, so it's Michael Marriott Rosarian, and there you'll find out about our Todd tours as well. And then I'm on Instagram as well, so Michael Rosarian, and you'll see various advertisements in that for various things as well. So yeah, Michael's Todd tours. If people don't know about them. They tend to be a day, right, Michael? And they're in various parts of England. Yeah. You usually use it, you and Rosie, and it's touring gardens and workshops. And so if you're in England and want to grab some quick one-day things, be sure to check out Michael's Todd tours. They are fantastic. And by the way, Todd stands for two old duffers. But they have become very popular, and we love doing them, and a lot of other people love doing them. So just one-day tours in various parts of the country. So yeah, check those out.
It's a wonderful opportunity if you can't devote an entire week to something to sample a little bit and a little there. And because Michael's so well known in England, he has access to a lot of private gardens and things you wouldn't normally be allowed to get into.
If you follow him on Instagram, you'll get to see some of the pictures of where they're going and where they've been. And they're incredible tours. Quick, easy, and just beautiful places. They go places I've never heard of, and you probably haven't either. Just wonderful. Well, time sure flies when you're having fun. Guys, this has been so fun to have you.
It's been great. I really enjoyed it.
Guys, just thanks so much. Have great days. And friends, thank you for joining us too. We hope you're now more than ready to get in the garden. Until next time, happy gardening.
You've been listening to the Rose Chat podcast with Chris Van Cleve and Teresa Byington, expert rose gardeners who want to help you achieve the rose garden of your dreams. Don't miss an episode. Listen anytime on our website at rosechatpodcast.com or listen on the go via the Rose Chat app on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Share this podcast with your social networks and join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the hashtag RoseChat. Join us next time for another edition of the Rose Chat Podcast. The Rose Chat Podcast is a production of the Rose Chat Media Group, Birmingham, Alabama.